Hello, everybody. I'm Robert Geiger for the Cosmos Society, an online community for the exploration and study of the ancient world. Guided by traditional classical studies, modern online tools, and our interest in the ancient Greek world. Membership to the Cosmos Society is by application at our website and is available to all interested persons, and there's no cost. Among other learning activities, we offer reading groups for ancient Greek and Latin works, both in English translation and in the original languages. We particularly encourage non-professionals who seek a welcoming environment for learning and discussion. Today, we're here for Cosmos Society's Open House Conversation Series with Professor Paul Cartledge. And let me tell you a little bit about Professor Cartledge's background. I'm not going to go through his whole bio, it's extensive. But he is the A.G. Leventis Senior Research Fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, and an Emeritus Professor of Greek Culture at the Faculty of Classics at the University of Cambridge. He has a distinguished academic background. He's written, co-written, edited, or co-edited over 30 books in the broad field of ancient Greek history. And amongst many honors, he's an honorary citizen of modern Sparta, I found out in conversation with him. His most recent book that I'm aware of, I think it's the one he'll be talking about today, is called Thebes, the Forgotten City of Ancient Greece. And it's available online at Amazon and I'm sure other sellers too. So let's please welcome Professor Cartledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert, and to Ian and to everybody else who's invited me. Not my first time. So I've talked to you all before about Sparta, which is what I did my Oxford doctoral dissertation upon. But I've wanted to study, obviously, other parts of Greece. Greece has many polis, as they call them, citizen-states or city-states, up to 1,000. But there are some that stand out. So shall I start sharing my screen? Thank you very much.
Please.
How does that strike you?
That's excellent. Paul, before you start, I forgot to ask you the question we always like to ask our speakers, which is, how did you get interested first in the ancient world or classic?
Right, well, that's a very long story. It goes back to the age of 8. For some reason, I was fascinated in the stories from Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it must be my parents bought me a very small version of the Iliad, a very small version of the Odyssey, told to the children. They were called, I still have them. And I don't know why, but I sort of fell in love with the heroes, of course, as well as the monsters, the tales of the Iliad and the Odyssey. I then went on to study ancient Greek from the age of 11, and I then studied classics. We called it Greats, which is first half of the degree course at Oxford was in mainly language literature, but also a little bit of history, philosophy, and so on, mainly language and literature. Then the second half of the degree was almost entirely ancient history, that's Greek, Roman, and ancient Greek philosophy. So I've been a classicist in spirit since the age of 8, and a classicist in a trained sense since, let's say, the late 60s, 1960s, that is, when I was at Oxford, 65 to 69, New College, Oxford. So why I'm interested particularly in Thebes, now that developed much later because, as I said, I've spoken to you before about Sparta. And Sparta was actually my research doctoral subject. I was a student of John Boardman, Professor Sir John Boardman, as he became. He's still alive, aged 96, amazing. And I went out to Sparta. I lived in Sparta, that is in southern Greece, southern Peloponnese of Greece, for over a year altogether. I was a student, as it's called, of the British School at Athens. And I studied the history, archaeology, broadly speaking, the culture of Sparta. I'm still studying it. from roughly 1000 BC to roughly 200 AD. That's the sort of time limits we set to the ancient Greek world, though the second half of that, Greece was actually conquered by the Romans. It became part of the Roman Empire. So the bit that most of us who are students of ancient Greek history, the time period we mostly study, is between about 700 BC and about 300, or sometimes down into the 3rd, 2nd, 1st century, but mainly 700 to 300 BC or BCE. And that's where my own expertise, such as it is, and interests focus. There were in that period, and this is something that probably not many people know, when we say ancient Greece, we don't mean one state, as we would mean if we're talking about modern Greece, but we mean a culture circle. The Germans have a word, Kulturkreis, within which Greeks, Hellenes, they called themselves, lived, flourished. And they flourished all around the Mediterranean and all around the Black Sea. And then following the conquests of Alexander the Great, who got as far as Pakistan and Afghanistan in the far east of the Greek world, that is where Greek is the principal either spoken or administrative language, the Greek world, Hellas, is much more extensive than the present state of Greece. I'm going to show you a map shortly, which is the central focus of that area. We sometimes refer to it as mainland Greece or Old Greece. So within mainland Greece and Old Greece, there are, broadly speaking, 4 major political entities, the ones around which ancient Greek history tends to be written. First of all, Athens. Secondly, Sparta. And they, of course, clashed as often as they collaborated, but they did crucially collaborate beginning of the 5th century BC in the early 400s against a great Persian invasion that tried to occupy all of mainland Greece, as well as what it already had, which was all of Asia, from Iran going west right up to the Aegean, what's now Turkey. And they also had North Africa in the form of Egypt. And so the Persian Empire was the biggest thing before, let's say, the Chinese Empire in the 2nd, 1st centuries BC, BCE. So Athens, Sparta, then Macedon. Well, I've mentioned Alexander the Great. Macedon wasn't a city, it was a state, and it was a region. And Alexander was the son and heir of Philip II. And for a brief period, in the second half of the 4th century BCE, Macedon was the center of the Greek world in terms of power. And indeed, it expanded into the Asiatic, the Persian Empire world as well. Well, now, alongside those 3, there was a 4th city, and that's the one that I'm going to be talking to you about. Now, why do I call it the lost city of ancient Greece, or in the title of my book, the forgotten city? There are really a couple of reasons. One is that Thebes never managed to establish itself for long enough as a major power. It was briefly, but it never managed to establish itself long enough to leave an indelible mark on the way we, that is post-antique people, think about ancient Greece. So what I'm going to try to do is recover for you the lost city of Thebes, which was lost, and this is the second way in which it was lost, quite literally, for 20 years, because Alexander the Great ordered that it be annihilated, with the exception of some religious spaces and one private house. So there was a period between the mid-330s and about 315 when there wasn't a Thebes, there wasn't an ancient city of Thebes. And Greeks were not, shall we say, scrupulous about never conquering other Greeks, but very rarely did they actually destroy the physical remains of another Greek city. Then the third reason, and this is more delicate, if you like, there was another Thebes, that is a city which, when people refer back to the ancient world, they use the word Thebes, besides my Thebes. And that other Thebes is in Egypt. And it's called Thebes because that was the Greek name given to it when Alexander the Great conquered it. I'm not going to go into all that, but the point is this. When people today hear the word or read the word Thebes, if they're not ancient Greek historians, they will probably be told about the Thebes in Egypt. And this was where, for example, most famously, Tutankhamun was buried in the Valley of Kings. It's modern Luxor in Egypt, a great big tourist hotspot. So anybody wanting to make a case for Thebes in Greece has to go through a bit of sort of ground clearing and throat clearing, as I am doing, to justify, and I hope I will be able to justify why you, that is non-specialists mainly, should be interested in what I have to say to you about ancient Greek Thebes. And I've subtitled this, What Have the Thebans Ever Done for Us? That's a joke, the Monty Python, What Have the Romans Ever Done for Us? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that they've actually done an awful lot more than possibly you had ever thought. So if I may, I'm going to move on with the slideshow now. Thanks. So this is, as I said, Old Greece. What you're looking at on your screen is what's sometimes called Aegean Greece. And my next map, my next slide is going to show you exactly where in this part of the world Thebes was. But before we get there, I just want to say there are about 700 separate Greek political entities occupying the shorelines around the Aegean, going south to Crete. And that's just part of the ancient Greek world of Hellas. Next slide, please. And so that arrows in on the region of Boeotia, Viotia in modern Greek, of which Thebes was the principal ancient city. And those of you who know your Greece will know a little bit to the south and to the east is Athens. And going further north, you come up to central Greece, to Thessaly, and then north to Macedonia. And this is a very flat, by and large, and on the whole, quite fertile region. The name may come from the B-O bit at the beginning, same as the beginning of a Greek word meaning ox. So it may be a reference to the abundance of water that was there for pasturage. And the arrow here is pointing, and it's slightly accidental, but you'll see an expanse of water there. This is Lake Copais. But if you go to Boeotia today, and you're going, for example, from Athens to Delphi, which is a very common route to take, and you go through Thebes, modern Thebes, same name as the ancient city, you'll look in vain for Lake Copais because it was drained in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And so it's just a dried up bed there now, exceptionally hot in summer. I should say, I once tried to find some shade in that region of Boeotia. I was driving down from the north, from Thessaloniki to Athens, and I try as I might, I could not find a single bit of shade. Sun was directly overhead, to be fair, so it can be exceptionally hot. Yep, next slide, please. Now, historically, or in this case, prehistorically, there were two cities, ancient cities of Thebes, in the way I deal with it in the book and the way I talk about it. There was the city of history and prehistory. That is the real, as it were, Thebes, how they really were, as historians put it, what Theban people did, where they lived, how they got their living, etc., etc. That's the history of Thebes. But there was another city besides the historical one, and that's the mythical one, the city of myth. Now, Greeks were extremely brilliant at inventing myths. We speak of it collectively as mythology, which literally means the study of myths. And myths are traditional tales, and they may be about the gods, they may be about natural phenomena, they may be about humans or superhumans imagined in the long, dim, distant past. Well, the Thebans were exceptionally fertile in devising myths about the foundation of their city, about the development of the early kings, and so on and so forth. But coming up against their fairly near neighbors, the Athenians, coming up against other Greeks who, for various reasons, didn't like the Thebans. The Thebans' myths, in their own words, in their earliest forms, which were epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey, have not survived. So although the ancients, that is, let's say Greeks from other parts of the Greek world, or Athenians especially, knew about these Theban myths, they had literature, they could recite them, and so on and so forth. We can't directly access Thebans' myths in their own words for the most part. So what we have, and I'm going to show you later, is a number of images, mainly Athenian, of what they imagined early Theban monarchy and early Theban history, myth history, we would call it, was like. Now, I'm a historian, so I'm a historian of myths, but I'm also a historian of actuality. And I'm starting you off in what I'm calling Mycenaean Greece. Now, Mycenae, I've underlined on the map in the Peloponnese, the southern bit of Greece. It is the type site. It is where Agamemnon in myth was king, who led the great expedition from Greece, from Boeotia, as it happens, to Troy. And so you get the Trojan War, so you get the Iliad. So this is what, in other terms, is late Bronze Age Greece in terms of technology, or late Helladic Greece. That's an art historical term. There are all sorts of ways of referring to the last few centuries of the second millennium BC, BCE. So between about 1500 and about 1200, there was something that we historians and prehistorians call Mycenaean Greece. Of those underlined towns, Thebes, you'll see on the map where Thebes is, just to the south and to the east of Lake Copais. At the north and to the west of Lake Copais is Thebes' main competitor and sometimes enemy, also Boeotian, in other words, speaking the same language, having the same myths of origin, having, broadly speaking, the same culture, Orchomenos. And Orchomenos is just as interesting in many ways. In fact, it's in some ways more obviously interesting than Thebes in the 14th, 13th centuries, which are the key prehistoric centuries of Mycenaean Greece. And I'm dwelling on this for two reasons. One, I'm going to show you some images, some artifacts from that phase of Theban history, prehistory. But I'm also going to be talking about myths of Thebes. And this is the period from which we think the Thebans and other Greeks derived their myths of origin and early history as they saw it. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as I say, we have some excavated artifacts. These come, these Linear B, which is the name given to the script, which is a script that is syllabic, so not alphabetic, but it's a form of Greek. And it was deciphered finally after these tablets were discovered a long time ago in Crete and in Mycenae and elsewhere in mainland Greece, also recently in Sparta. Linear B, so-called because it's modeled on, in some respects, another non-Greek language called Linear A, an earlier language which is found on Crete. And these tablets were preserved accidentally. That's to say, they were baked because the palace within which they were stored was burned. I won't say burned to a crisp, but it was certainly very seriously burned and destroyed round about 1200 BC. By whom, in whose interests, we're not absolutely sure. Was it external people, even non-Greek people, or was it a local uprising? There are all sorts of explanations, but at any rate, one advantage is that we now can read some of the Greek texts of the 13th century, the 1200s BC. And purely for the sake of example, I am showing you one which illustrates grain namely the grain spelt, which is FAR in Latin, farrago, ultimately from there. And there are also here listed units of wool, because what the tablets register is what the palace authorities demanded be handed in the way of taxation from local farmers and shepherds and so on. This is a palace bureaucracy, and the palace bureaucracy of Thebes is one of the great Mycenaean late Bronze Age sites. Next slide, please. Now, this is more obviously visually exciting and interesting, also from the palace area, also therefore from the destroyed site. But you notice on the slide I've put from Cadmea. Well, now, that is the name that the historical Thebans gave to their Acropolis. That is the main central space of Thebes, even in historical times, as well as in prehistorical times. And why was it called the Cadmea? Because the Thebans had a foundation myth. And if it's not unique, it's one of the very few foundation myths which postulates that their original founder was not a Greek, but a foreigner. His name was Cadmos, that's the name they gave him. And he allegedly came from what is today Lebanon, from Phoenicia, from Tyre. And why did he come to Greece, to mainland Greece, from Asia, from Lebanon, in pursuit, first of all, of his sister, who had been nicked, who had been stolen? This is a little bit of a euphemism because the Greek word can involve sexual molestation, if not rape, by Zeus. Zeus, great father Zeus, living on Mount Olympus in North Greece, the most powerful of all the Greek gods, father of the gods, dominant religious figure of the late Bronze Age and much, much later in historical Greece as well. And so Cadmos, according to this myth, comes to first Crete, and then he tries to find eventually his sister, and he pitches up in Boeotia, and he's told to found a city where he finds a cow, and he finds the cow, and then the rest is history, or rather prehistory. And there are all sorts of associated myths, namely that the walls of Thebes, which in historical times were famously big with 7 gates, they were built by 2 famous heroes to the accompaniment of music. This is all myth, but the point is that the Thebans of the historical period were of the view that once upon a time their ancestors were very powerful, but they had foreign origins. Very interesting. Anyway, one little bit of, in a way, support of the notion of a certain connection, at any rate, of Thebes with the Orient in the late Bronze Age is this. Well, it's in Greek a pyxis, which is a toilette box made of ivory, very fancy, and one imagines belonging to a woman, therefore to a princess or perhaps even a queen. And what interests me is not only its material, which has to come, of course, from the East, it's elephant ivory, but the actual scene of opposed sphinxes, what the Greeks called sphinxes. Now, there's a famous sphinx, I'll come back to her, who caused a great deal of difficulty for the Thebans, again in myth, but she was very, very female. And the historical Greeks, who were in this respect, as in others, sexists, they thought all monsters were by definition female. And so the Sphinx, their Sphinx, had to be female. But the original Sphinx, go to Egypt, the famous Sphinx statue, which stands in the Egyptian desert, they're all male, and these are male. So what the Greeks have done is they borrowed the idea of an animal, which is a combination of a lion, an eagle, so most powerful beast, most powerful bird, and you've got a human head surmounting them both, but they're basically lion type mixed with eagle type figures of great power. So this represents monarchical, I'm pretty sure, regal power. Next slide, please. Now I'm leaping, and this is, I was talking there about something from the 13th century, from the 1200s. What followed the destruction of the Palace of Thebes, as elsewhere in Greece? The palaces are destroyed in Mycenae, in Tiryns, in Knossos, in Sparta, is a period of relative cultural desolation, certainly decline, to such a degree that some people talk about dark ages. And yet, during this period, the what we call epic tradition of oral composition of poetry, it not only has begun in the late Bronze Age, it survives the cultural catastrophe of the destruction of the palaces and survives in a continuous flow until in the 8th century or possibly the 7th century BC, the 700s or the 600s, the first texts in a new alphabetic script are written down. And that's why ultimately we have the Iliad and the Odyssey. We don't have the 4 Theban epics because they weren't preserved in the same way. Well, now there's a specific possible connection between this artifact on the screen, which is a wine mixing bowl. That's what kratia in the top line of the caption means. It's where you mix wine, typically 3 parts water to 1 part wine. But in the Odyssey, you'll find reference to a wine that is so strong, it has to be diluted 20 parts, 20 times with water. At any rate, what's the connection in myth between this scene and the epic tradition? Well, it is precisely the 2 figures at the left side. In the middle, you've got a ship, and what I think the artist has done is put on top of each other a ship which has 2 rows of oarsmen beside each other. Now, it's not impossible that there was a 2-banker, and therefore this might have 50 rowers, and they're in 2 banks, but I think it's probably side by side. Anyway, on the left is a man grasping the hand of a woman and leading him, or some would say forcibly encouraging her onto the ship. Well, various people, various mythical creatures, mythical personages have been suggested as those 2. And one of them is Theseus and Ariadne from Crete. That's an Athenian with a Cretan princess, and he's taking away from Knossos. But another one is that it is an Iliadic scene of Menelaus and Helen. So the Trojan War was caused, this is all myth, by the abduction of Helen from Sparta to Troy in northwest Asia Minor. Eventually, after 10 years, the Greeks managed to wear down the Trojans and to enter the city and rescue Helen. And conceivably, we have here Menelaus, that's her husband, her jilted, her cuckolded husband, recovering Helen. At any rate, the main point probably is that this is quite a fine vase that, though it was made in Athens or the region round it, that's Attica, that's the clay, the paint, the decoration, it was found in a grave in Thebes. So that tells you about a certain amount of contact of a possibly personal, possibly economic kind. Next slide, please. And so I'm now moving on to the Theban local tradition. That previous image was of a non-Theban, an import. This is a locally manufactured bronze of a god who was, of course, universally worshipped in Greece. After Zeus, he's one of the most prominent and powerful. His name is Apollo. And this was a dedication of bronze. You can see the geometrical forms. The torso is an inverted triangle. The head and neck is a triangle. But nevertheless, this is probably a little bit later than the full-blown geometric period which we saw on the previous vase. And he was found in a shrine of Apollo, not far from Thebes. And what's interesting is we get one of the earliest instances of the Theban version of the Greek alphabet. Now, I mentioned that the alphabet, an alphabet. was created, invented in the 8th century BC by someone somewhere in a Greek part of the world. We're not sure. It could even have been in the Aegean area. It could have been on mainland Greece. There's all sorts of arguments about the dating and the function, the purpose of the invention of alphabetic writing. The consequence of it is unambiguous. Whereas in the Linear B syllabary, there are something like 200 signs and symbols that you have to master. So that this is a scribal script. The alphabet is, as it were, democratic. It's universally available, 24, 28 letters. That's all you need to master. You can learn it from the age of what, 2, 3, anywhere upwards from there. Now, this particular instance of writing all round the thighs and the groin of this bronze of Apollo, it looks like Apollo, it's meant to be Apollo, was dedicated to him by Manticlos. And you possibly can't see the caption in its entirety, but it says, "Please, Apollo, give me something pleasing in return." In other words, I've spent a lot of my hard-earned cash on commissioning this work, solid bronze. I'm now giving it to you. You've got to do your bit. And that's very ancient Greek religion. In Latin, they say do ut des. I give in order that you may give back. Ideally more than I've given, but at least as much. Next slide, please. And this is another Apolline image of, in this case, a life size. And you can see the word on the screen, kouros, which means young man or adolescent. And he comes from the same shrine, as it happens, not far from Thebes. And he's in marble. And it's been estimated that to make a life-size sculpture such as this would take the sculptor about a year, including the sourcing of the marble, the roughing it out, the etc., assuming that, of course, it doesn't break, it doesn't show cracks. It would then be probably, it might be at any rate partially or possibly totally painted. What we see is the naked marble, which we find attractive. Whether the Greeks did is another question. They seem to have been keen on painting. And no fewer than about 100 of these have been found in the 500s BC. So the Boeotians, the Thebans, and their neighbors were very keen on this shrine having dedications of this image made, and they thought obviously that Apollo in return would do them some favors. Now, I mention this partly because Apollo, among his many attributes, was he's god of music, and I'm going to come back to one particular Theban musician. But the Thebans themselves, in their own time, labored under the accusation, the extremely unpleasant sort of biased representation of them by the Athenians as being culture-free, that is, uncultured, rustic boors. Not true. And I hope by just showing you a few artifacts, and one in particular shortly, you'll not be taken in by the notion that the Thebans were merely Boeotian pigs, interested only in the things of the stomach rather than the things of the mind or the head. Next slide, please. Right, so now I said I'd show you some images which are Athenian, but they are of Theban myth. And this particular one is, I'm told, the title character, Antigone, of the most performed ancient Greek play still being performed, often in English or in other vernacular languages, but nevertheless the most performed today. Very unusual to have a female heroine giving her name to a tragedy. And the interesting point about this is that she is the daughter as well as the sister of Oedipus. Oedipus was, though he didn't realize it himself, a Theban, and his parents were given an oracle from the oracle at Delphi saying, your son's going to kill you. So they put him out. As soon as he was born, they tried to expose him to they told one of their servants to kill him, to leave him on a hillside, or to actually physically do away with him, so that there'd be no possibility of his killing them. However, you can guess how it went on. He was actually rescued and brought up by another royal family. And then, in circumstances uncertain, he wanted to take a trip back to central Greece. And he, of course, encountered his actual, real, natural father, whom he killed. And so he then goes to Thebes, which is not far from where he killed his father. And Thebes was being besieged by the Sphinx. And she's a terrifying monster spreading plague amongst the Thebans. So this is really not a place that you want to go. And there's one way in which her power can be reduced, and that's by answering the riddle of the Sphinx. There is more than one version of what it was, but nevertheless, Oedipus, being a smart guy, managed to solve it. And one version of what he solved was what goes on 4 legs in the morning, and on 2 in the middle of the day, and 3 in the evening. Answer: humans. Man. In the morning, she crawls as a baby. In adult maturity, on 2 legs, walks. In old age, walks with the aid of a stick. At any rate, he solves the riddle. He's welcomed into Thebes with terrific welcome, open arms. He becomes king. He's made king in place of the man he's just murdered without realizing he's just murdered him. He marries the widow of the man he's just murdered, and then produces with her, among others, Antigone and another sister and 2 brothers. So incest, horrors. The Athenians, I think, were particularly interested in this myth because it made the Thebans look not absolutely great. And when this vase was being painted, this is actually painted in South Italy of the early 4th century, but based on Athenian originals. The Athenians and the Thebans were not best pals by and large. And so it was a way of Athenians sort of glorying in their superiority to the Thebans, that they portrayed bad behavior by Thebans in myth. For example, Creon here is depicted as a tyrant, and the Athenians are democrats. They don't like tyrants, that is, autocratic sole rulers who rule by force and not by law and consent. Next slide, please. So Sphinx, as imagined by an Athenian maker of this pot and painter of this remarkable composite vase, found actually in South Italy, though it was made in or near Athens. And I just show it there because there is a rather lovely version, not a particularly horrific one, of a very female Sphinx. And I'm going to show you another female Sphinx, non-Athenian, non-Greek indeed, later on. Next slide, please. And another scene from a Greek tragedy, and in this case, one that Euripides, not as in the previous case, Sophocles, is most famous for. This is his Bacchae, or the women who are devoted followers of the god of wine and metamorphosis, Bacchus, otherwise known as Dionysus. So enamored were the women of Thebes. Now we're going back into the distant Theban history of the royal family as it was then. Once upon a time stuff. Pentheus was the king of Thebes. He was a descendant of Cadmos. And his mother became enamored of Dionysus to the extent that she went into a kind of trance together with her sister. And they so were, shall we say, deluded that they imagined Pentheus, who was very hostile and suspicious of this allegedly new type of religion, this fantastic religion where the women go mad and they go raving on the mountainside and so on, round Thebes. At any rate, Kithaeron is the mountain. Here we see his mother, Agave, together with her sister, rending apart Pentheus because they think of him as a wild animal. And there are scenes in the play Agave is actually holding Pentheus's head, which has been ripped off his shoulders. And she thinks that it's a wild animal's head, not her son's head. So the Theban royal family, shall we say, has a pretty murky past, which the Athenians are quite keen on dwelling on in the 5th and 4th centuries. Next slide, please. Now, I said that Thebes actually has quite a strong musical tradition, and their worship of Apollo is one sign of that. But the key piece of evidence that I want to show you, he's seated at the bottom on the lower register, bang in the middle, and his name is Pronomos. This again is made in Athens, but in this case, there's a good reason for it being made in Athens, because he was, of his day, the greatest player of that instrument, which is known as the aulos. It's a reeded instrument, a kind of double, sometimes it's called flute, but it's actually more like an oboe. And he was the top player in the entire Greek world. And therefore, if you are funding a play in Athens, and in this case, you're funding a satyr play, a play where the chorus consists of half man, half beasts. And that means that you're funding tragedies because the satyr drama was added to the tragedies, oddly enough. I mean, it's a sort of light relief after the tragedies. You then need to get, if you're wealthy and you're ambitious and you want your playwright and your performers to win, there was a competition for the best player of the aulos. And Pronomos, that was his name, he won it round about 400 BC. Next slide, please. Now, this is I'm ending with myth for a bit, just very briefly, just a couple of minutes on the real Thebes. Historically, Thebes came to dominate its region of Boeotia by about 500 BC, when it was ruled by a form of regime we know as oligarchy. That is, a few Theban citizens ruled the city as a whole. There was a notion of citizenship, and there is a view that Theban type of self-government was the same elsewhere in Boeotia, and indeed that all the Boeotians might even have been united in some way in a kind of proto-federal system. That's not absolutely certain. What is certain is that regime of the Thebans, when the Persian Empire threatened to conquer mainland Greece and indeed invade it in 480 BC, massive by land and sea invasion, the Thebans, instead of joining the resistance, which was organized by Sparta with Athens, relatively small and feeble though it was, nevertheless, there was a resistance. The Thebans went over to the Persian side. And for that, they were doomed to suffer. I started off by saying that Thebes for 20 years ceased to exist in the 4th century BC. That's because Alexander the Great, used the fact that the Thebans had been traitors to Greece in the early 5th century, 140 years before, as his excuse for annihilating Thebes, because they're just anti-Greek. He had other reasons, actually, for wanting to destroy Thebes, but nevertheless, that was a suitable pretext. Well, that Thebes survived, obviously, the Persian Wars. And as an ally of Sparta in the rest of the 5th century, it actually defeated the Athenians in the biggest, to that date, war between Greeks, the Atheno-Peloponnesian War. And Thebes came out of that war relatively quite strongly. And this particular gravestone is of a man from one of the Boeotian cities allied with Thebes called Tanagra. And so it's possible that this is a casualty of that great war that I've been talking about. Next slide, please. Now, we move on 40, 50 years. A lot happens. I'm cutting lots of corners. But Sparta emerged from the great Atheno-Peloponnesian War of the last third of the 5th century, top dog in mainland Greece. However, it abused really its position of power, its hegemony, to such a degree that former allies of Sparta, most obviously Thebes, got fed up with it and actually formed a coalition, anti-Spartan coalition, together with Sparta's old enemy, Athens. And so you get peculiar period of about 20 years, beginning of the 300s, 390s, 380s, when Thebes and Athens and some other cities are lined up and fighting against Sparta and its allies. Well, eventually Sparta wins that round, but then the whole thing starts up again. And a further round, if you like, of internecine, inter-Greek rivalry culminates in 371, big battle in Boeotia, not far from Thebes, Leuctra. And at that battle, the Thebans, who by then have become a formidable military force. It's a complicated story, but two particular individuals, Epaminondas and Pelopidas, between them responsible for developing Thebes into such a formidable military force that it can not only take on the Spartans when they attack them, but actually beat them. And they beat the Spartans hollow. Thebans allied with the Athenians, 371. That gave rise to, and now you see at the top of the slide, the caption, 371, 362, what's sometimes called the Theban hegemony of all mainland Greece. Thebes for 9-10 years was the top dog in all Greece until another major battle, Thebes and its allies against Sparta. And this time it was a kind of draw. Thebes sort of won, but nevertheless not decisively. Epaminondas was killed, Pelopidas already dead, and Thebes then ceases to be the unquestioned top dog in all mainland Greece. Next slide, please. And this is just to show you the image that that the Thebans were able to put out of themselves and their allies. This is from one of the other Boeotian towns or cities, Thespiae. That is a typically Boeotian shield on the left. And the Thebans' power came principally from its infantry, backed up by its cavalry. Next slide, please. And so this is the end, this is the sad end of ancient Thebes as anything of a major power in its own right. So the historical Thebes, together with Athens again, loses a major battle in Boeotia, a place called Chaeronea. But its opponent now is not Sparta, it's the new boss of all mainland Greece, namely Macedon. Macedon under Philip II and later his son and heir, Alexander III, who becomes called the Great. Well, the decisive battle for the conquest of mainland Greece by Macedon was this particular Battle of Chaeronea, 338 BC. The lion, you see, has been put together from lots of fragments and erected on a plinth to mark where, at any rate, part of the fighting at the Battle of Chaeronea happened, where many of the Thebans' most powerful fighters, the so-called sacred band, which consisted of 150 men couples. They were supposedly erotically related, 150 times 2, 300. 254 corpses have been excavated round about this memorial to the Battle of Chaeronea. End of Thebes as a great power. They were then conquered, then dominated, then actually occupied by Macedon, which had a garrison put in and all sorts of things. Thebes was actually physically destroyed. Next slide, please. And this is just to show you a very different era. And I've chosen this particular image of a woman, a dancer made of terracotta, then painted from the same place as that funeral stele of Saugenes. This is also from Tanagra, which is famous for making things like this. But I chose a dancer, 3rd century, 2nd century BC, because, next slide, please, and then the one after. Next slide is we're leaping forward to the reception of Thebes, how later, in this case, painters, this is anger, thought back to how important Thebes once was. And this is Oedipus being quizzed by the Sphinx, who's on the left, rather a ferocious, fearsome lady in the shadows. But by this time, Oedipus, the Oedipus myth, was part of Western cultural consciousness, as it, of course, became again in the 20th century, thanks to Sigmund Freud. And so, 19th, 20th century. Yes, so if we could move on from anger, this is early 19th century, to my final slide, and this is why I chose the dancer. Leon Bakst was the co-director of the Ballet Russe, famous group of dancers founded in the 1900s. And we see here one of his own designs. He was a painter, a designer, a theatre director and all that for his own ballet called Narcissus, and in French, Narcisse. And this is a Béotienne, so it's a female Boeotian lady. And my point is that there is a Theban reception. There is a very strong tradition of Western music, all sorts of plays and ballets and operas, which are derived from ancient Thebes. Yes, ancient Thebes has come through Athens rather than directly itself, but nevertheless, we owe a terrific lot of our cultural inheritance, our heritage, to not only just ancient Greece as a whole, but specifically to ancient Thebes. Thank you.
Thank our speaker. Thank you.
Welcome, welcome.
All right, I'm going to stop screen sharing and open it up for questions. And if you have a question, raise your hand, because I think that'll be more effective than. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to start out one, if that's all right. Host prerogative, I guess. You talked a little bit about the language and alphabets and so forth, and a lot of us here are interested in the Greek language. So by the classical era, say before Thebes was destroyed, how did its dialect compare, say, to Athens? Would they have understood each other clearly? Would they have, Okay.
That's an excellent question. Now, the earliest Greek that we have, as I said in my talk, is the language that's written in Linear B script. So that goes back to the 14th century. But by the 8th century, which is when Homer was, as it were, written down, the Greek language generically has been divided specifically into at least 3 dialect groups. So we have Ionic, and we have Doric, and we have, this is the Thebans one, Aeolic. Now, Doric is the language of the Spartans, the dialect of the Spartans, so much of the Peloponnese. And then if you look on a map, you'll see that across the Aegean, so Sparta is towards the south of Greece. If you go due east and keep over to the Asiatic mainland, that's the Doric sphere of the Greek language. Move up and you come to the Ionic. Now, Attic, that's the Athenian, is a version of Ionic. And do the same, go across due east to what's central Western Turkey. Ionia, the Greeks called it, that's Ionic. But there is also just north of the Athenians, the Thebans, the Boeotians, and then the Thessalians, and they speak what's called Aeolic. Now, all those 3, and there are, of course, sub-variants depending on the town and the precise region and the time. Those 3 main dialects are inter-intelligible. So typically speaking, if a Spartan heard an Athenian speak, he wouldn't have problem understanding. The Athenian might make a joke that the Spartan's accent was very different from his, but nevertheless, he could by and large pretty much automatically understand Spartan Doric. Now, there's one anomaly, which is Macedonian. I don't want to get deeply into the issue, but because Macedonians amongst themselves did not speak a standard form of Greek that was automatically comprehensible in the way that I've mentioned, the other three dialects were, some southern Greeks, Greeks south of Macedon, chose to believe the Macedonians really weren't Greek. That is, they weren't really speaking Greek. And the explanation of this probably is that amongst the Macedonians' language, which is basically Greek, probably, were loanwords from the surrounding non-Macedonian peoples, especially Thracians. But Macedonia is bordered by Paeonians and goodness knows other non-Greek speaking peoples. So a Macedonian talking amongst themselves would be unintelligible to a non-Macedonian Greek speaker. However, when, let's say, Demosthenes goes to Pella, the capital of the Macedonian kingdom, to negotiate, there's no question but that what he says and what Philip or Philip's counselors say to him are mutually intelligible. So there's no question of Macedonians not being able to speak a standard form of Greek. And in their inscriptions, that is the written examples of Macedonians writing, it's all in standard Greek. So there's not in dialect. So the answer to your question about the Boeotians is that there was no issue for the Thebans of them not being understood elsewhere.
Thank you. Okay. Maria, I'm going to see if you can unmute yourself for your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paul, to hear this great, as always, talk. It is so well documented. I was wondering whether it could be possible to comment or to share with us some insight about another connection that Thebes has, that with Hellespont, Colchis, and the Black Sea region, because we know that Phrixus and Helle were the children of King Athamas of Boeotia. So could you please share with us some insight on this part of the Theban connection? Thank you very much.
Well, thanks. I mean, it's all part of, I've really nothing to add, Maria, simply just to say that that's another dimension, thank you for mentioning it, of this very wide-ranging set of interlinking myths which place Thebes in connection with Asia Minor, and in this case, of course, further east, going to the far eastern end of the Black Sea, to the kingdom of Colchis. And so the Hellespont is so cool because it's the Pontos, the Sea of Helle. And it's the connection, it's the link between the Aegean and the Black Sea. But I've no further insight to share as to why or how that particular connection between Boeotia and the Hellespont and so on should have been forged, except to say that I think there were lots of traders in the 14th, 13th centuries who were traveling around between Greek and non-Greek worlds and using the Hellespont as what we call the Dardanelles as their mode of passage, their point of passage up towards the Black Sea. Sorry not to be able to give you any other insights than that, but thanks for reminding us all.
Thank you very much.
Gail, please go ahead.
Hi, yes, thanks for this wonderful talk. I'm just going to give you the audiobook version of your recent book on Thebes, the Forgotten City. Is wonderful. The narrator is fantastic, and it's quite easy to listen to. It's not so erudite that that you can't listen to the text and enjoy it. My question is, you mentioned that it was very rare for one Greek city to destroy or obliterate another, and yet Plataea was destroyed first by Sparta around 427, and then later again by Thebes, I think around 373 or thereabouts. And I'm wondering what the animosity of Sparta and Thebes was to Plataea.
Yes, well, you're completely right that it is rare. I wrote an article very recently in the Cambridge World History of Genocide. Now, it's a very dangerous word, genocide. One has to use it very sparingly. And in order to get round the fact that Greeks didn't aim to wipe out all other Greeks, which to me is what genocide would mean, they were selectively homicidal, if you like. The word was used herbicide. And so I examined 8, I think it was, case histories of herbicide beginning in the 6th century, that is in the 500s. Your examples are in the 5th and 4th centuries, where there once upon a time were 6 settlements on the island of Lesbos. At some point in the 500s, we're not told why, the other 5 ganged up on one of the 6 and obliterated it. So in the, as we say, historical period, the 5th century, 4th century, there are only 5 cities of Lesbos. But Sparta and Plataea, well, the reason for, it's the same reason, by the way, both in a way, why Thebes and Sparta both wish to destroy or at any rate seriously damage Plataea. Because Plataea, though Boeotian, so in other words, speaking Aeolic Greek, having as its myth history the background we've been talking about, Athamas, Oedipus, Cadmus, that's Boeotian history, chose in 519 BC to separate off, to, as it were, revolt from the Boeotian group, to join as an ally Athens. So it was becoming an ally of a city with a different culture in terms of myth history, different language, and that really irritated the Thebans, who wanted all Boeotians to be altogether solidary under their rule, but no Thebans, no Boeotians were to be allowed, as it were, to escape. And so what they're doing when they get angry with Plataea is reminding the Plataeans that they are Boeotians. Sparta, now this is much more complicated because according to our original source, which is Herodotus, it was a Spartan king who advised the Plataeans to make an alliance, to seek an alliance with Athens, because that would irritate the Thebans and therefore sow dissension in mainland Greece between the 2 major cities, Athens and Thebes, thereby weakening any possible resistance to Sparta's domination if the Spartans wished to get involved in mainland Greece, in the middle of mainland Greece, in central Greece, which they did in the 5th century after the Persian Wars. And so you get to the Peloponnesian War. The very first city that was attacked by an ally of Sparta, namely Thebes, was Plataea. The Peloponnesian War, as we call it, the Atheno-Peloponnesian War, starts off, this is Thucydides, Book 2, with the Thebans attacking Plataea and trying to conquer it. And of course, later, as you rightly say, their allies, their principal, their leader, Sparta, does conquer. It sieges Plataea for actually 3 whole seasons, 429, 428, 427. And after 427, having used some quite complicated flamethrowers, having built tunnels to undermine, putting an awful lot of effort into defeating Plataea, they finally do. And then actually there is an odd situation where the Spartans grill some Plataeans that they've captured, and they ask them, what service have you Plataeans performed on our behalf, the Spartans, in the Peloponnesian War? Well, it's obviously a nonsense question because the Plataeans are allies of the Athenians. But the point is to give the Spartans justification for treating Plataea the way they did. And that's as you describe it. They destroyed Plataea probably in 426 rather than 427, but at any rate, round about then. Whereas Thebes, having been angry with Plataea since 519, it's not until the 4th century when they're really powerful, and we're in that period I told you leading up to the Battle of Leuctra in the 370s, and it's in 373, as you rightly say, that they chose to, well, we're not exactly sure if they laid it waste completely or significantly damaged the main urban center. But at any rate, they did something pretty nasty. And so you'll get Plataeans who are in exile. This is quite a common experience of Greeks because they're quite often expelled by a rival political grouping, not necessarily an external enemy. Okay.
Okay. Thank
Thank
you.
you for that. That was great.
Pleasure.
So-
Just one thing to add about the audio book before we go. You may or may not have noticed the speaker, whom I've been in touch with, is a Northern Englishman. Now, I say last, but he says last. So when you listen to it next, it's a bit like the difference between Athenian and Spartan, as it were. It's a regional dialectal difference rather than a linguistic. It's not a different language. He's reading my English, but he's reading it in a Northern English accent.
It's interesting. In the US, we say last also.
Of course, absolutely. Yeah.
So-
We're a
so
dying
we've-
breed.
So we've gone over our time, but George, I want to give George an opportunity to ask a question because he's been waiting
Absolutely.
patiently.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to thank you. This was an absolutely beautiful lecture, very, very exciting and so concise. 2 questions. One is that you mentioned Herodotus and the sparking, the king of Sparta,
yeah.
sparking the problems with Thebes and Athens. What book is that in? Is that
That's
6?
in book 6. Yes, completely right. 6. The
Book
king
6.
is Cleomenes the First. And it's very interesting how Herodotus, on the one hand, has received extremely negative view of him as a person. He drank too much. He went mad in his older age. On the other hand, Cleomenes was fiercely good for Herodotus on the major issue of his work, which is attitudes to Persia. And Cleomenes was utterly sound that Greeks should not give in to Persia, should resist Persia, should do everything they could to resist. He actually died before the major Persian invasion. He died round about the time of the Battle of Marathon, which was the first Persian invasion. Sorry, your second question.
Second one is I checked my map, and Argos is part of the Argolid, not Boeotia. But would you see any connection with the traveling of Jason and Medea from Colchis down to that region?
Oh, yes. I mean, Perseus, there are all sorts of connections. Argos has a claim to being, in a way, the aboriginal Greek city, because in Homer, he never uses the word Hellenes to describe all the Greeks. He calls them, you're quite right, Argives, or he calls them Danaans, and he calls them, there's a third one, which is escaping me at the minute. But Argives, what does that mean? Well, one meaning of Argos is sort of a mainland, a piece of territory, not just a particular city. And so it's possible that the whole of the Greek mainland was thought of once upon a time as Argos. At any rate, the Argives, as you rightly say, are a very powerful ancient Greek people. The city's been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. and it's very, very much part of early Greek mythology, and you've given one part of it. But they don't much interfere with or coincide with the main story which I've been telling, which was more Boeotian, Theban, Athenian, and to some extent Spartan. Argos and Sparta were at odds since they were the principal two enemies, in the way that Athens and Thebes in central Greece, Argos and Sparta in the Peloponnese were eternal enemies.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thanks. I know we have a couple more questions, but we really run out of time, I think. So we'll just have to save them for internal discussion.